It is the summer of 1667. You are standing on the deck of a Spanish merchant sloop, anchored in the shallow green waters of the Gulf of Venezuela. The air is thick, equatorial, unbearable. To the south, Lake Maracaibo stretches inland like a second sea, 70 miles long, still as glass, ringed by mangrove and mosquito swamp. Your cargo is cacao, tobacco, and hides. Your crew is 12 men, 2 of them sick with fever. You have 4 cannons. You have never fired them in anger. And then, from behind the sandbars of the Barra de Maracaibo, the narrow strait connecting the lake to the Gulf, you see sails, not 1, not 3, 8 vessels, moving in formation, flying no colors. The lead ship is a captured Spanish frigate, 20 guns, and she is coming straight at you. The man commanding that flotilla is a Frenchman. The Spanish call him El Demonio. The Buccaneers of Tortuga call him by the name of the town where he was born, L'Olonnais, François L'Olonnais. And he is not coming for your cargo, he is coming for you. What happens next, and what happened to hundreds of Spanish soldiers, sailors, and colonists who crossed his path in the 1660s, is one of the most disturbing chapters in the history of Caribbean piracy. Not myth, not Hollywood, documented, witnessed, and recorded by a man who sailed with him. This is the true story of François L'Olonnais, the indentured servant who became the most feared pirate of his age, the man who ate the heart of a Spanish prisoner, and the butcher who was, in the end, butchered himself. To understand L'Olonnais, you have to understand the machine that created him. In the mid-17th century, France was building a Caribbean empire on the backs of disposable men. The system was called the engagé trade, a French version of indentured servitude that shipped thousands of young men from the ports of Normandy, Brittany, and the Atlantic coast to the sugar plantations of Martinique, Guadeloupe, Saint-Domingue, and the pirate haven of Tortuga. The terms were brutal: 3 years of labor in exchange for passage, food, and a promise of land or wages at the end. In practice, the promise was a lie. Engagés were sold, traded, beaten, starved, and worked to death in tropical heat. Mortality rates rivaled those of enslaved Africans on the same islands. Many did not survive their contracts. Jean-David Now was one of these men. Born around 1630 in Les Sables d'Olonne, a fishing port on the Atlantic coast of western France, the town that would give him his pirate name, he arrived in the Caribbean sometime in the early 1650s, almost certainly as an engagé. The details of his contract and his master are lost. What survives is the result. By the time his indenture ended, Now was not the same man who had boarded a ship in France. He was something else entirely. He drifted to Hispaniola. The island shared uneasily between Spanish Santo Domingo in the east and the lawless French settlements in the west. There, on the northern coast, he joined the Buccaneers, the wild hunters who lived in the forests, smoked meat on wooden frames called boucans, hunted feral cattle and pigs, sold hides to passing ships, and answered to no colonial authority. It was a brutal, free existence, and it was the nursery of Caribbean piracy. From the boucans of Hispaniola, it was a short step to the longboats, and from the longboats to the ships. By the early 1660s, Jean-David Now had become François L'Olonnais, a name taken from his birthplace, as was common among buccaneers who shed their old identities like dead skin. He was operating out of Tortuga, the rocky island off Hispaniola's northwest coast that served as the unofficial capital of French buccaneering. And he had discovered something about himself. He was very, very good at violence. L'Olonnais' early career is sketched in broad strokes by our primary source, Alexandre Exquemelin, a French-Dutch surgeon who served with the Buccaneers of Tortuga and later published his account as De Americaensche Zee-Roovers in Amsterdam in 1678. The English translation, The Buccaneers of America, appeared in 1684 and became one of the best-selling books of the 17th century. Exquemelin is our window into L'Olonnais, and our problem, because Exquemelin was both eyewitness and sensationalist. a man selling books in a market hungry for horror. What Exquemelin tells us is this: the governor of Tortuga, a Frenchman named de la Place, gave L'Olonnais his first ship, a small vessel and a crew, and sent him out to raid Spanish shipping. This was standard practice. French governors used buccaneers as unofficial naval forces against Spain, issuing letters of marque or simply looking the other way. L'Olonnais took to it with ferocity. His early raids along the coast of Cuba and the Yucatan established a pattern that would define his career: extreme, theatrical cruelty against Spanish prisoners. According to Exquemelin, L'Olonnais would hack prisoners to pieces, slice flesh from their bones while they were still alive, and burn captives who refused to reveal the locations of hidden valuables. The methods were not random, they were systematic, designed to break the next prisoner faster by making him watch what happened to the last one. The Spanish certainly believed the stories. Colonial governors along the coast of Venezuela and Cuba issued standing orders. Do not surrender to L'Olonnais. Fight to the death. It is better to die in battle than to be taken alive by this man. That order, recorded in multiple Spanish colonial documents, tells you everything about the reputation he had built by the mid-1660s. There is one more incident from this early period that Exquemelin records. L'Olonnais was shipwrecked on the coast of Campeche, in the Yucatan, and his crew was attacked by Spanish soldiers. Most of the buccaneers were killed. L'Olonnais survived by smearing himself with the blood and entrails of the dead and lying among the corpses until the Spanish left. He then crept into the nearest town, disguised himself, convinced a group of enslaved men to help him steal a canoe, and paddled back to Tortuga. The story may be apocryphal, but it tells us how L'Olonnais was remembered, as a man who would do anything, literally anything, to survive. In the spring of 1667, L'Olonnais assembled the largest buccaneer fleet anyone in Tortuga had ever seen. 8 ships, 660 men, according to Exquemelin, though that number may be inflated. His flagship was a captured Spanish vessel of 20 guns, crewed by veterans of a dozen raids. His lieutenant for the expedition was Michel Le Basque, another feared French buccaneer. Their target was the richest prize on the Spanish Main, the twin cities of Maracaibo and Gibraltar, sitting on opposite sides of the Great Lake that opened into the Gulf of Venezuela. Maracaibo was a prosperous colonial trading town. Cacao, tobacco, sugar, hides, silver from the mines of New Granada. Gibraltar, smaller and farther south on the lake, was its satellite. Both were defended, but not heavily. A fort at the Barra de Maracaibo, the narrow entrance from the Gulf into the lake, and small garrisons of Spanish soldiers in each town. Against 600 buccaneers hardened by years of jungle warfare, these defences were paper. L'Olonnais forced the Barra in a direct assault. The Spanish fort, a stone watchtower with a battery of perhaps 16 guns, fired on the buccaneer fleet as it approached. L'Olonnais landed men on the shore, attacked the fort from the landward side, and took it by storm. The garrison fled into the jungle. The buccaneers spiked the captured guns, burned what they could not carry, and sailed into the lake. Maracaibo was next. The townspeople, warned by fleeing soldiers, had already begun to evacuate into the surrounding forest, taking what valuables they could carry. L'Olonnais entered the town to find it half empty. What followed was a systematic, weeks-long campaign of extraction. The buccaneers fanned out into the countryside, hunting down fleeing colonists, dragging them back into town, and torturing them to reveal where they had hidden their wealth. Exquemelin's descriptions of these tortures are specific and clinical. The hallmark of a man who watched them happen. Prisoners were strapadoed, hung by their wrists from beams with heavy weights tied to their feet until their shoulders dislocated. They were wooded, a knotted rope tied around the head and twisted with a stick until the skull began to compress and the eyes bulged. They were burned with slow matches held against their skin. They were cut, not to kill, but to make them talk. Exquemelin records that several prisoners died under torture without revealing anything, either because they had nothing to reveal or because they chose death over betrayal. After Maracaibo, the fleet sailed south across the lake to Gibraltar. The pattern repeated. The town was taken. The population was hunted. The torture continued. In Gibraltar, Exquemelin notes, L'Olonnais personally interrogated prisoners, and when one group of Spanish soldiers captured in the forest refused to show him an alternate route out of the jungle, he drew his cutlass and hacked one of them apart in front of the others. Then, according to Exquemelin, licked the blood from the blade and told the survivors they would be next. The Maracaibo-Gibraltar campaign lasted roughly 8 weeks. By Exquemelin's account, the Buccaneers extracted approximately 260,000 pieces of 8 in coin, plate, gems, and goods. A staggering haul, one of the largest in buccaneering history. They also took hostages, enslaved people, and church silver. They burned parts of both towns before leaving. L'Olonnais returned to Tortuga, a rich man and a legend. But the legend was not one of daring or cleverness. It was one of horror. The sack of Maracaibo was, above all, a campaign of systematic torture, and it is the event that defines L'Olonnais in the historical record. Flush with Maracaibo plunder, L'Olonnais planned an even more ambitious campaign. In 1668, he assembled another fleet, 5 or 6 ships, roughly 700 men, and sailed for the coast of Central America. His target was the Spanish settlements of Honduras, with a possible push inland toward the rumored wealth of San Pedro Sula and the trade routes connecting the Caribbean coast to the Pacific. This campaign was a disaster from the start. The fleet was becalmed in the Gulf of Honduras for weeks. Supplies ran short. The Buccaneers were forced to land and forage along the Mosquito Coast, raiding indigenous villages for food. L'Olonnais attacked and sacked the small Spanish settlement of Puerto Caballos, modern-day Puerto Cortes, but found little of value. He then attempted to march inland through dense jungle towards San Pedro Sula, a journey of roughly 50 miles through some of the most difficult terrain in Central America. The march was a catastrophe. The Buccaneers were ambushed repeatedly by Spanish soldiers and indigenous fighters. The jungle was impassable. Disease, malaria, dysentery, tropical infection tore through the column. L'Olonnais pushed on with diminishing numbers and increasing desperation. It was during this march, Exquemelin tells us, that L'Olonnais committed what may be his most infamous act of cruelty. Frustrated by a Spanish prisoner who refused to guide him to San Pedro Sula, L'Olonnais cut the man's chest open with his cutlass, tore out his heart, and, in Exquemelin's words, bit and gnawed at it with his teeth, like a ravenous wolf, saying to the rest, "I will serve you all alike if you do not show me another way." That is the single most famous sentence in the entire history of pirate literature. It comes from one source, Exquemelin, and no Spanish document confirms it. But it is the sentence that made L'Olonnais immortal. The inland campaign collapsed. L'Olonnais retreated to the coast with a fraction of his force. His reputation among his own men shattered. The fleet broke up. Captains and crews deserted, taking their ships and their share of what little plunder remained. L'Olonnais was left with a single small vessel and a handful of loyal, or trapped, followers. He drifted south along the coast of Central America, desperately seeking provisions and a way home. His ship ran aground, or was wrecked, somewhere near the Gulf of Darién, on the coast of what is now the border region between Panama and Colombia. And there, according to Exquemelin, François L'Olonnais met an end that even he might have considered fitting. He was captured by indigenous people. Exquemelin identifies them as the Indians of Darién, likely the Kuna or a related group. They killed him. And then, Exquemelin writes, they tore him in pieces alive, threw his body limb by limb into the fire, and his ashes into the air, to the intent no trace nor memory might remain of such an infamous, inhuman creature. The man who had torn out hearts was himself torn apart. The symmetry is almost too perfect, which is why some historians suspect Exquemelin shaped the ending for literary effect but no alternative account of L'Olonnais' death exists. The Darién coast was one of the most isolated and dangerous regions in the Americas. It is entirely plausible that a small group of shipwrecked buccaneers, weakened and starving, were killed by indigenous defenders who had every reason to treat European intruders with extreme hostility. Whether the specific details, the dismemberment, the burning, the scattering of ashes, are literal fact or narrative embellishment, we cannot know. What we know is this: L'Olonnais disappeared from the historical record sometime in 1668 or 1669, and no one ever saw him again. Nearly everything we know about François L'Olonnais comes from one man, Alexandre Exquemelin, and that is a problem. Exquemelin was a real person. He arrived in the Caribbean as an engagé himself, possibly for the French West India Company, and served with the Buccaneers of Tortuga for several years, likely in the late 1660s. He was trained as a barber surgeon, a common role on buccaneer ships. His account, first published in Dutch in 1678, was translated into Spanish, English, French, and German within a decade, and became the foundational text of pirate literature. Without Exquemelin, we would know almost nothing about L'Olonnais, Henry Morgan, or the daily life of the Buccaneers. But Exquemelin was not writing a neutral historical document. He was writing a book for sale. The full Dutch title translates roughly as The American Zee-Roovers, a title designed to sell. The book was published by Jan ten Hoorn, an Amsterdam publisher who specialized in adventure and travel literature. The market demanded spectacle, horror, and exotic detail. Exquemelin delivered. This does not mean Exquemelin invented L'Olonnais' cruelty. Spanish colonial records, particularly the correspondence of colonial governors with Madrid, confirm that a French buccaneer called L'Olonnais operated in the Caribbean in the 1660s, that he sacked Maracaibo, and that he was regarded by the Spanish with exceptional terror. The broad outlines are real, but the specific set-piece atrocities, the heart-eating, the blood-licking, the ravenous wolf speeches, are Exquemelin's alone. No corroborating source exists. The honest historical position is this: L'Olonnais was real, his campaigns are documented from multiple sides, his cruelty was extreme enough to produce genuine panic among Spanish colonial populations, and the specific methods of torture described by Exquemelin are plausible within the context of 17th century buccaneering, where violence against prisoners was common, and where a reputation for cruelty was a strategic weapon. Whether L'Olonnais literally ate a human heart, we cannot prove. Whether he was a man of exceptional and systematic brutality, the evidence leaves little room for doubt. Most famous pirates get rehabilitated by popular culture. Blackbeard becomes a showman. Anne Bonny becomes a feminist icon. Henry Morgan becomes a rum label. L'Olonnais does not get rehabilitated. He is too ugly for redemption. In fiction, L'Olonnais appears almost exclusively as a villain, or as a reference point for villainy. In Raphael Sabatini's Captain Blood novels, the casual cruelty of French buccaneers is the backdrop against which the hero's English decency is measured. In the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise, the idea of a pirate so terrible that other pirates fear him echoes the L'Olonnais archetype more than any other historical figure. In television, from Black Sails to Crossbones, the spectre of buccaneers who tortured for sport hangs over every scene, a shadow that traces directly back to Exquemelin's pages. But perhaps the most important cultural legacy of L'Olonnais is one most people do not recognize. He is one of the reasons the word buccaneer carries a darker edge than pirate. The two words are often used interchangeably, but they are not the same. Mai, pirate, is a legal term, unauthorized robbery at sea. Buccaneer evokes something more specific. The French and English raiders of the 17th century Caribbean, men who operated in a grey zone between privateering and outright savagery, and whose violence against prisoners went far beyond the pragmatic needs of robbery. Exquemelin's book crystallized that distinction in the public imagination, and L'Olonnais is the book's most vivid exhibit. François L'Olonnais was born into a system designed to break men. The engagé trade shipped him across the Atlantic as disposable labor, fed him to the plantations, and spat him out into a lawless frontier where violence was the only currency that held its value. He did not resist that system. He mastered it. He became the most efficient practitioner of cruelty in the 17th century Caribbean, not out of madness, but out of method. The torture was strategic. The terror was the product. Every mutilated prisoner was a message to the next town. Surrender everything, or this is what awaits you. And in the end, the frontier consumed him the way it consumed all of them, the way it consumed Morgan's health, Blackbeard's luck, and Rackham's nerve. L'Olonnais died on a jungle coast, far from the sea, stripped of his ships, his men, and his power. The man who had torn out hearts was torn apart in turn, and his ashes were scattered so that, in Exquemelin's words, no trace nor memory might remain. But memory did remain, because Exquemelin wrote it down. And now you have heard it. If this story gripped you, subscribe to this channel, because next time we are going back to the Golden Age of Piracy with the story of another pirate who made the Caribbean tremble, but for very different reasons. That video is coming soon. I will see you on the next voyage.